Good morning, everybody. I would like to thank you all for coming in this morning, and we'll start by introducing the panel who will speak in turn after me. Malcolm Newsom, who will present on behalf of himself and Gary Ridgway, our review team. Chief Constable Stephen Watson, the leader of Rochdale Council, Councillor Neil Emmett, Sarah Rowbotham, Maggie Oliver, and then Deputy Mayor Kate Green, and I will say something as well after Kate. Back in 2017, shortly after I was first elected, the BBC documentary, The Three Girls, was first broadcast, and it was followed by The Betrayed Girls, the documentary. It prompted a public debate about child sexual exploitation in Greater Manchester, and specifically the making of a serious allegation that lessons from the tragic death of Victoria Agolia in Manchester in 2003 and the failure of Operation Augusta in Manchester were not learned by GMP, and that this led several years later to similar failures in Rochdale. That is not something I could ever hear and ignore. It led me to establish this wide-ranging review, and the report being published today finds unequivocally that failures that could and should have been avoided were in fact repeated. In the words of the report, it represents a, quote, lamentable strategic failure by leaders in the Greater Manchester system at the time. Over many years, Greater Manchester Police failed to give the investigation of these serious crimes the priority and resources necessary. The report is hard to read. It gives a detailed and distressing account of how so many young women were seriously harmed and appallingly failed. But it does fulfill the central purpose of why I set up this review in the first place. It is only by facing up fully and unflinchingly to what happened in all of its horrifying detail that we can be sure of bringing about the whole system culture change that is necessary on this critically important issue. I would like to thank those who have had the courage to come forward and share what happened to them. We know how difficult it must have been for you and still is. We are sorry that you were so badly failed by a system that should have protected you. I have asked the Deputy Mayor to ensure that all necessary support continues to be provided to you, also to the organisations who have supported you, and I know that Kate will address this when she speaks. We wouldn't be here this morning, and this report would never have happened were it not for the efforts of Sarah Rowbotham and Maggie Oliver. To blow the whistle when things are wrong takes determination and courage. It has personal consequences in so many ways. Today's report fully vindicates them and their decision to do so. They have done a major service to those they supported every step of the way, as well as to wider public protection in Greater Manchester going forward, and we thank them both for it. It is important to make clear that the events described in this report took place over 10 years ago, and that things have changed in that time. The people who were involved at a decision-making level are no longer working in Greater Manchester. Recent Ofsted inspections have found the way children at risk of sexual exploitation are protected by Rochdale's children's services has improved. GMP has established a specialist force-wide child sexual exploitation unit. Many perpetrators have since been brought to justice. Nevertheless, the public will rightly want reassurance on a number of points. First, that any new leads arising from this report are fully investigated and perpetrators pursued regardless of the passage of time. I have asked the Chief Constable to address that issue shortly. Second, that internal disciplinary action is taken against individuals who failed in their duties. I have asked both Greater Manchester Police and Rochdale Council to address this matter directly, and am today making the same request of the Crown Prosecution Service in the North West. It is truly shocking that Amber, who it was recognised in early 2011 was a victim and wrongly arrested in 2009, was subsequently named as a co-conspirator in September 2011 and on the indictment for the trial. The report finds that this was due to a legal tactical decision to bring out evidence in court critical to Operation Span. The fact that it was done without her knowledge or any regard for her welfare or safety is shameful. In response to this revelation, I am today writing to the Chief Crown Prosecutor for the North West, requesting that he investigate whether any disciplinary action is appropriate in respect of those involved in this decision, and also to report on whether there is any protocol in place now to prevent a repeat of such a decision, and if not, to introduce one. The report also contains a very troubling revelation with relation to Child 44 and the retention of a fetus following a termination. The retention with neither her knowledge nor consent, nor that of her parents. I have asked the Chief Constable to review that specific issue, as well as GMP's current practice and training arrangements in respect of the Human Tissue Act. The report covers many other serious issues, and to take us through the detailed findings, I would now like to invite Malcolm to come forward to present. As he does, I wish to take this opportunity to thank him, to thank Gary, and the previous Deputy Mayor, Baroness Beverly Hughes, for sticking the course on this difficult task, for doing such a painstaking and forensic job, and in so doing, enhancing the protection of young people in Greater Manchester. Malcolm.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. In 2017, the BBC broadcast a documentary, The Betrayed Girls, about child sexual exploitation in Greater Manchester. This documentary alleged that the Crisis Intervention Team, a sexual health service in Rochdale, had notified GMP and Rochdale Council of dozens of cases of child sexual exploitation prior to 2008, but that both agencies had failed to protect these children. Although Operation Span concluded in 2012 with the conviction of 9 men, it was alleged that GMP had been aware of on-street grooming of vulnerable children since 2004 and had failed to address these crimes. Furthermore, Maggie Oliver, a former Greater Manchester police detective, alleged that during Operation Span, GMP chose not to record many crimes disclosed to them by children and that their perpetrators were potentially left to continue their abuse of children. Over the last 6 years, several senior officers within GMP and Rochdale Council have said there was little merit in a further review of these well-documented events. Notwithstanding these reservations, Baroness Beverly Hughes, the then Deputy Mayor of Greater Manchester, was clear that assurance was required on these fundamental concerns. We would like to acknowledge and secure the completion of this report. This report has taken over 6 years to complete, primarily because of the time taken to negotiate the legal complexities in accessing sensitive and personal information held by the statutory agencies. We have researched a vast quantity of contemporaneous records and the detailed case files of 59 children. We invited for interview those individuals we believed could assist our review. Many helped our work, for which we give thanks. Others, regrettably, declined to be interviewed or failed to respond to our invite. We also interviewed 3 survivors. They were all subjected to the most profound abuse, and all 3 had engaged with Operation Span. We applaud their courage in coming forward and are grateful for the support provided to them by Maggie Oliver and her foundation. Their harrowing stories evidence the severe damage to their welfare perpetrated initially by their abusers and subsequently by the criminal justice processes they were exposed to. I will now summarise our main conclusions. We have found compelling evidence that there was widespread organised sexual exploitation of children within Rochdale from at least 2004 onwards. Sarah Rowbotham and her colleagues at the Crisis Intervention Team repeatedly shared their significant concerns during this period with police and children's social care, but the statutory agencies failed to respond appropriately. Very little disruptive or investigative action was taken to tackle these very dangerous individuals, and children were left to be abused by them and subsequently by their associates. In 2007, frustrated by this inaction, Sarah Rowbotham formally notified GMP and Rochdale Council to the presence of a suspected organised crime group dealing in the sexual and criminal exploitation of children in Rochdale. GMP and its partners chose to not progress any investigation against these men, as they were informed that the children were too frightened to assist any inquiry. This was a serious failure to protect these children. It was not for many years, and well after we had commenced our review, that any charges were brought against any of these men for the abuse they committed during this period. While a small-scale investigation commenced in 2007, this investigation resulted in no charges or convictions. GMP under-resourced the inquiry despite repeated requests for support by the officers concerned. Our review has revealed that this pattern was repeated time and again. Over many years, GMP and Rochdale Council were made aware of significant networks of men engaged in the widespread exploitation of children, but failed to prioritise their protection. In 2008, a 15-year-old child disclosed that she had been repeatedly raped and sexually assaulted by staff at a takeaway restaurant in Rochdale. This was a complex inquiry, but senior officers within GMP failed to provide additional resources. Consequently, the investigation only scraped the surface of what had occurred. It is our view that had this investigation been sufficiently resourced, it may have strengthened the evidence to proceed with the prosecution. In 2010, a detective inspector in the Rochdale Division provided compelling information that there remained in Rochdale an extensive network of individuals exploiting vulnerable children. However, senior officers within the Rochdale Division failed to put in place the required additional resources to support a major investigation. Operation Span was launched at the end of 2010. Although the first senior investigating officer put in place a comprehensive plan to identify all victims and suspects, he was removed within weeks, and subsequently the investigation began to focus on a small number of men identified as suspects from the very beginning. We conclude that while Operation Span successfully convicted 9 men, it failed to address the numerous crimes and instances of exploitation brought to the notice of GMP and Children's Social Care at the time. Many children's testimonies were ignored and their abusers were not brought to justice. Furthermore, promises to support the victims during and after the trial were not forthcoming, and these young people were left to be harassed and intimidated by the men who had previously abused them. Operation Doublet, initiated in May 2012, was triggered by concerns in the media that a significant number of perpetrators remained at large following Operation Span. While the public face of GMP was reassuring the public that the investigation of the past exploitation of children in Rochdale was a priority, this was far from the case on the ground. Once again, the senior investigating officer repeatedly struggled to sustain sufficient resources to meet the demands of a complex investigation, and on many occasions lost staff to support investigations that were viewed as a higher priority by his superiors. The 2 serious case review over reports published in 2013 by Rochdale Local Safeguarding Children Board explicitly criticised Sarah Rowbotham and the crisis intervention team for not following child protection procedures and for not communicating appropriately with other agencies. In contrast, our review has found compelling evidence to support the view that the crisis intervention team was sharing significant information with the authorities, and senior managers were aware of this prior to the publication of that report. It was a gross misrepresentation to suggest that Sarah Rowbotham and the crisis intervention team were in some way were complicit with this failure and to tarnish the reputation of this small group of professionals. The human cost of these failures to the child victims cannot be overstated. Child 3 was sexually exploited and abused from the age of 14, and this continued for many years. She gave evidence to support the cases of other victims in the Operation Span trial in the belief her own abusers would later be brought to justice. This never happened, and after the trial, she was threatened with violence, her house was vandalised, and she was hounded out of her home and neighbourhood. When she requested help from GMP, none was forthcoming, and she was left with nothing, homeless, and with 2 children. Child 44 was made pregnant at the age of 13 by her abuser, who was in his late 30s. Unknown to her and without her consent, GMP took possession of her terminated fetus and retained it for several years at Rochdale Police Station. It was not until 2011, after it was discovered following a routine property review, that she was notified of its existence by Detective Maggie Oliver. Amber was sexually exploited and abused between the ages of 14 to 16. She cooperated fully with the Operation Span inquiry, disclosing countless crimes and identifying many suspects. None of these crimes were formally recorded by GMP. This subsequently presented a difficulty for the prosecution, which needed to use her evidence. As a legal tactic, the prosecution named her as a co-conspirator, although it was known she was a victim who had been abused by the men on trial. Amber was not informed that she would be named on the court indictment and was unable at any stage of the procedure to defend herself against these allegations. Nor were any steps taken to protect Amber from the foreseeable threats to her safety. Following the trial, someone threatened to petrol bomb her house, and postings were made on social media identifying where she lived. It is disappointing that although the Rochdale Serious Case Review Over report covered the period up to and including the Operation Span trial, it did not mention how Amber was treated and the damaging consequences of decisions made around her designation as an offender rather than as a victim. It was not until the 12th of April 2022, following the appointment of the current Chief Constable, that GMP issued these 3 survivors with a public apology for these failures. In our report, we initially considered in detail the experiences of 59 children. As our review progressed, we identified 111 children in total. We have concluded that there was a significant probability that 74 of the total number of these children were being sexually exploited. Of these 74, we found that we could only provide assurance that 3 children were appropriately protected by the statutory agencies. In 48 of the cases, there were serious failures to protect them. Towards the end of last year, GMP provided the review team with a schedule of convictions resulting from the 3 major operations that have occurred following the conclusion of Operation Span. In summary, this information demonstrated that in total, 30 men had been convicted and most had received lengthy prison sentences. While this is a significant number of successful convictions, we have noted that these trials only included 13 children in total, of whom only 6 had previously been known to the crisis intervention team and are included in our cohort of 74 children. We therefore plan to return to this matter in the final part of our assurance review. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Stephen Watson, the Chief Constable for Greater Manchester. Today's report into non-recent child sexual exploitation in Rochdale is the latest chapter in a story with which the public are now sadly increasingly familiar. As is entirely fitting, this report does not pull its punches. The findings evidenced within it are shocking, stark, and shameful. It speaks to the systemic failure of various agencies to pull together and do the obvious and the right thing. And above all, it outlines in painful detail all of those missed opportunities where decisive action could and should have been taken to prevent, disrupt, and prosecute the scourge of what has been evidenced to have been the widespread abuse of children in Rochdale some 10 to 20 years ago. Amongst those agencies legitimately criticised is Greater Manchester Police, and it is on behalf of GMP that I offer my heartfelt apology to all of those victims whom we let down so badly. Relatively soon after taking up office in GMP, I was privileged to meet some of the Rochdale victims of CSE personally, and I took the opportunity both to apologise to them and to hear firsthand of their dreadful experiences. Today, therefore, must principally be about the victims and survivors of the weighty trauma that they suffered at the hands of heartless criminals who frankly cared not a jot for the impact of their offending behavior on the still forming lives of these then young girls. I am so sorry that your childhoods were so irretrievably blighted and scarred with such profound consequences. One of the primary responsibilities of the police is to protect the vulnerable from the cruel and the predatory. And in this regard, we failed you. In respect of GMP's failures specifically, the report highlights clear evidence to suggest that CSE in Rochdale was both widespread and known about amongst those with the responsibility to act. Exploited children were poorly safeguarded and on occasion not safeguarded at all. Organizational responses were generally too slow in emerging. They were under-resourced and they were prematurely curtailed despite it being clear that there was more to do. Offenders were neither effectively disrupted nor properly brought to justice. Senior GMP officers failed to address what was clearly a strategic issue with a fitting and sustainable strategic solution. And GMP failed to heed the voices of those who were speaking up on behalf of victims and who were pointing to the inadequacy of the organizational response. And it is at this juncture that I too would like to pay tribute to Sarah Rowbotham and Maggie Oliver. This report speaks very clearly to the credibility of the concerns that they had expressed and acknowledges their personal and persistent advocacy on behalf of so many vulnerable girls. Both Sarah and Maggie have traveled a hard road in the interests of others, and we are all substantially indebted to them. They, of course, remain impassioned advocates for victims, and I am especially grateful to Maggie and her foundation, who against an agreed protocol with GMP now meet with senior public protection officers on a monthly basis to discuss all specific referrals that come through her foundation. This is an essential element in making sure that no child should ever fall through the cracks again, and provides an invaluable safety net and bolsters our contemporary practices and multi-agency arrangements. I do consider that the language of needing to learn lessons has become somewhat hackneyed in the public mind. Far from reassuring people, particularly when these types of findings have all been heard before, it causes decent people to feel enormously frustrated at the failure of agencies, including the police, to simply do what we are paid for and to do it professionally. In this context, and in respect of learning, however, I do think it important to draw a distinction between then and the way that CSE is now dealt with by the police and our partner agencies. The lessons from our past have been well and truly learned, and they are solidly baked into today's practice. I would never stand here and complacently assert that we are perfect. We are certainly not. And regrettably, mistakes could well similarly be made into the future. But what I am saying is that our current practices and working arrangements have altered dramatically. They are now reflective of the highest nationally derived professional standards. Our frontline officers are better trained so that early referrals are effectively handled and routed. Every district across Greater Manchester contributes to a multi-agency, complex safeguarding hub. GMP's contribution to the Rochdale hub, for example, today consists of 10 detective constables, 2 detective sergeants, a detective inspector, all of whom are overseen by Detective Chief Inspector. Each of the district safeguarding hubs are supported by GMP's CSE Major Investigations Team. This is a corporate resource which comprises 107 dedicated officers. The expansion of this team owes much to the direct support of the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, for which I am grateful. Those working on the hubs or as part of the CSE MIT are highly specialist officers who are trained to an exacting standard. GMP's strategic approach to CSE is now effectively governed. This governance encompasses all aspects of training, professional practice and development, as well as practical case management. Woven into the very fabric of our response to CSE are a number of external agencies and third sector organizations, such as the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, We Are Survivors, Manchester Rape Crisis, the St. Mary's SARC, and as has already been outlined, Maggie's Foundation too. These agencies are here to help GMP, to provide challenge, to advise, and to give voice to vulnerable people. Our practice is informed by Operation Hydrant on behalf of the College of Policing, which produces authorized professional practice for our senior investigating officers. And we are inspected directly by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and indirectly by Ofsted, who assess our partnership arrangements. In short, I am confident that GMP and our partners now have the capacity and the capability to meet the highest of standards sustainably and to dynamically adopt different approaches where necessary to reflect further organizational learning, amendments to national best practice, and to pivot very quickly to recover live situations when we get things wrong. It remains, of course, a source of profound regret that we cannot turn back the clock and undo all of the damage done to innocent young lives. I do, however, want to reassure both victims and the public that we remain determined to do all that we can to bring offenders to justice. Since Operation Span and the 9 men then convicted, in Rochdale alone, a further 135 arrests have been made, 432 charges have been laid, and 32 convictions obtained, which have resulted in 355 years imprisonment for offenders who might have thought that they had escaped justice. Last year, Op Lytton resulted in the conviction of a further 5 offenders for a further 22 offences, and these men were sentenced to 71.5 years imprisonment. As of today, we have another 34 individuals who are currently charged and are due to stand trial during this year and next. In addition to Op Lytton, which continues, there are currently a further 7 live CSE investigations taking place in Rochdale. With reference to the 74 children which Malcolm has referred to, GMP has directly engaged with 72 of them. There are sound risk-assessed reasons for not engaging with 2 of the 74. But nonetheless, our victim-led responses to date reflect what they are asking for perfectly understandable reasons, including a reluctance to reopen old trauma. A majority of the 72, who are of course now adults, engaged by the force, feel unable to provide evidence to support a traditional criminal justice outcome. For some, procedural justice is just as important or indeed more so, than criminal justice, and we are supportive of survivor-informed choice. 26 of the 72 have, however, reported specific offences and have or are supporting prosecutions. We will continue to engage with all of these survivors and to shape our responses to their requests and preferences. From a policing perspective, and wherever possible, we are, of course, keen to mount criminal prosecutions such that offenders can be properly brought to justice and held to account. The door will remain ever open to survivors of CSE, and we will work at a pace that reflects their needs. We would encourage all victims of CSE always to come forward and access the care and the support that we are keen to offer. The GMP that I lead will pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry relentlessly and without fear or favour. I know that some who might have thought that they had got away with these dreadful crimes are now living in fear that a reckoning is coming. My message to these people is that you are right to be fearful, and you may be the next person that we arrest. No matter the passage of time, we will continue to develop the evidence to put you away. This is the least that we can do for those whom we have let down and whose experiences have so galvanized my officers to embody the improvement that the contents of this report demands. Thank you.